Simone Tolumello. I'm part of Project Dash, which organizes this seminar today at ICS in Lisbon. Thanks for being here in the room and online. So today we have Els Keunen. I hope it's a proper pronunciation, from the University of Stuttgart, who's gonna present her work on housing for mobile populations. And we have as a discussant Joanna Lages from the Dynamic Set at ISCTE. This is an event co-organized among the DASH project with the Portuguese Network for Housing Studies, Rede Nacional de Estudos sobre Habitação, REDH. And so without further ado, we're going to have Els presenting and Joanna commenting. You're going to say yes, great.
I do prefer to stand. So good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here and to be presenting my PhD research. I will be talking about housing for mobile populations, about experiences of Anglophone tenants in Douala in Cameroon. Let me see, can we make it? Yes, good. And so before I start, I would like to thank the organizers, especially Sonia, Simone, who made this possible, who thought about this possibility for me to present here, and I'm really grateful for that. A little bit about me, just for having a bit of context, also maybe the positionality of me for doing this research. I have kind of like a double career, one more in international cooperation, the other one more in academia. And so I have been working in international cooperation. For 2 years, I was in Africa, in Uganda, in Kampala, working on a slum upgrading project. Then I was 4 years in Mozambique, working as advisor on urban planning. And then I changed to academia. I got immersed at the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies in the Netherlands, where I was working much more as academic staff. I did miss Africa, and so I went back to Africa and started working in Cameroon, while also starting a PhD. And so this is also where the PhD comes from. While I was working as advisor on citizen participation, I also started working on the PhD. And then since 2023, so since October, I have now been working at Stuttgart University, where I am doing the PhD. So just for a bit of context, of background of who I am. And I would like to invite you just to get a bit of feeling of like who has experience or who knows a bit about Africa for the discussion later on. So if it is possible to scan the QR code, maybe. Does it work like that? It's working. Yeah. Yeah? Oh, and I think I need to start it. Yes, you need to. Good. So what I would like to know, who has been in Sub-Saharan Africa? So one more yes than no. Yes, some people without phone. It's okay, no, it's just to get a bit of an idea. So we have some people yes, some people no. Let's see the next one. For Cameroon, is there anyone who has ever been in Cameroon? So that I know how careful I need to be about what I'm saying. That's a good thing. About my claims. Very good. So we have at least someone who has been in Cameroon before. Very good. Good. So this was just for me to get an idea. Is it okay like that? Yes. Good. For how this PhD came about and where I got the idea from is actually from research that I was doing while I was working at IHS in the Netherlands, we did some research in East Africa, in Uganda and Somaliland, and so there, one of the questions, so it's really like a tiny part of that research, was about when did you last move? We asked people in the 4 different cities that we were studying, and so for Kampala, we found that half of the population had moved within the last 5 years. And so for me, that was something really eye-opening. This is not moving across the country or across national borders, but it could also be moving within the city. But still, for me, as an urban planner, it suddenly somehow opened my eyes. For tenants, and that's on the right, you can't really see it, for tenants this was even higher, so this was 71% of the tenants had moved within the last 5 years. And so as urban planner, I really started to think, what does that mean for planning the city? And so in 2 different ways, you can think about how do you plan for such a mobile population? Do they have any specific needs? Do they have any specific desires? Are they different from more static populations? And the other one is also how to plan with mobile population, right? I was always teaching about participatory planning, but if you have people who are not even planning to be there for a long time, how do you then plan with them, right? How to engage with them? Do you even want to engage with them? Do they have a stake? Should they have a stake? So it really got me thinking, and this was kind of the basis for my interest. A big disclaimer, these are not the questions that I will be answering today, because what we then were thinking is we first need to better understand what is actually happening. How are people moving? How often are they moving? Where are they moving to? How are they getting access to the city? And so these are then the basic questions for my research. So as an overview of what I want to present to you today is first a little bit the rationale of the PhD. I want to give you a bit of insight in how does the Douala look like, what are a bit of the characteristics, and then what drives the moving decisions of people, of the Anglophone migrants, and to what extent are rental transaction processes adjusted to mobile populations. That second part is very much a work in progress, so I'm just presenting a very first thinking about that. But I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about that as well. So what I would like to learn from you, and that's perhaps so that you can already start thinking for the discussion later on, I think it would be nice to get a bit of feedback of the findings within their context. So if you have knowledge about Cameroon, about Sub-Saharan Africa, like how does it resonate, what I am presenting to you, but also how does it work for your context, right? So how are you in your context planning or for mobile population? How does housing for mobile populations, how does that work within your context, including the role of the rental housing sector? Maybe also like how can I improve on the presentation, the way I'm presenting, also the content of it, and perhaps any other comments and suggestions, right? For you to keep in mind so that we can have a discussion afterwards. Good. The overall rationale of the PhD is what actually I wrote. So I'm doing a PhD by publication. This was the first article that I wrote. I argued that residential mobility, so how people are moving to the city, within the city, out of the city, in a sub-Saharan context is actually substantially different from how that works in the global north. And so then I made 3 position statements of in which way that is different. And so the first one is, I said, actually the mobility patterns and the dynamics are quite different. You have much more the circular migration, you have different ways in which people are moving, you have the step migration, people trying to move out of the country but first moving to the city, etc. And then the second position, yes?
Can you show us full screen without
yeah, I think it doesn't work, right?
Oh no. No, but the Zoom thing remains. So.
Okay. So it's not possible.
You can grab the little screen, you know, like if you go to there, exactly. You move that thing down.
we try to do this? Okay, if anyone knows, we can try. It's that the titles are not there. I didn't plan very well.
It's fine. All perfect.
Good. No. Okay, good. Let's continue in the meantime, right? So the second position statement is that people's options of where they move within the city are different, or they have much less access to social housing, for example. And then the third one is, how do people access a place? So how is the transaction, the rental transaction going, or the land and property markets working? But then specifically in my case, I'm looking at rental housing. And so from there, what I did in that first paper, I also thought about how does that then impact on the African city. I'm not going to talk about that in the further research, but so that was the idea of the paper. And so I was saying that the translocal practices that you see much more in an African context, they do reduce the urban groundedness, so the rootedness, the place attachment of the population. And so there's also certain processes of residential sorting that might, also of ethnic exclusion, that might generate or might result in certain spatial inequality, and the lack of governance systems might also make that cities are actually going beyond the capacity of what they can actually sustain. So these were the three propositions. So this is more like a proposal that I'm saying we still need to test this. The first three is then where I want to go into depth, like what is it really that we understand about this. And so what I want to present today, oh no, yes. Oh, yeah, so then actually I started looking into like what are now the mobility dynamics. I really tried to work out for each and every interviewee that I had, how do they move from where to where, why, etc. I had some trouble in making that into a narrative, and so maybe this is also an idea for thinking about afterwards, like how can I use that? I didn't use it in the end, even though I think there are some nice aspects of that analysis, but so what we decided to do is for the first paper, or first findings paper, to focus more on why do people move? So not exactly like what are the dynamics, because we felt we would need more quantitative data, but more understanding the decisions that people are making. And so that's what I will be presenting today. And then focusing also on that third question, how do people get access to a place in the city through the rental markets? Good. Long introduction. A little bit more about Douala. So Douala is the largest city. It's not the capital city, but it's the largest city in Cameroon. It's about 3.5 million people in 2015. You know how unreliable statistics are, so there are very different numbers that are going around as well, but so it is several millions at least. The projected growth also, you probably know that about Sub-Saharan Africa, the urban growth is very quickly. And so if you translate that into numbers per day, is actually that you would see that every day you would need to have 65 more housing units provided. And so that kind of like gives you a bit the idea of like the explosive growth that is happening in African cities, especially these bigger cities. It is a port city, so it is located on the very, wait, let me see, over there. It's really the economic hub for Central Africa, and so it's a very attractive location for labor migration. Most of Cameroon, let me see if I can, so all that white part and the dark blue littoral, all of that is French-speaking, but then these light blue areas over there, northwest and southwest, they are English-speaking. So there are two different languages, or the colonial languages that are there. There's many, many more local languages, but so there is this kind of divide also in the way that these regions are being governed that also has created some frictions. And so it is the Anglophone tenants that I will be talking about, so the ones who are coming from these Anglophone areas who have moved to Douala. In a way, the Anglophone is also used as kind of like an indication, a broader indication of an ethnic group. So there are different ethnic groups, and so they are often lumped together as Anglophone. And so it's not just the language that they speak, but it's also like referred to as an ethnic group in itself. Good. A little bit more spatially looking at Douala, so you have the ocean here, but so you can see there's a big estuary, and then Douala is located a little bit more inland, but so it has the port here, and then it has certain areas that are very densely, so the red areas, the more red is where the population is very dense, and what you can see is that there is a big flood hazard because it's a very low-lying area. All those green areas actually are wetlands, and so there's a lot of areas that are at very high risk of flooding, that basically floods very often, but then the water goes away again. But so that also increases certain risks of buildings collapsing, and so that's also why there are certain other events happening that I will be talking about a bit later. Some impressions just to get a bit of a feeling of the town. So a lot of it is built up in like concrete or like solid material, but so you also have the more like traditional housing with the ironclad over here with wooden planks. Is a lot of houses are built with wooden planks. You have like more the wetland areas where also some people are living, but not so many. And so these would be more the outskirts of the town. Just for some ideas of how it looks like. Now, one more thing to know about the Cameroon context is that there is a crisis or a war ongoing internally. So since 2016, there has been an ongoing conflict where there is the two Anglophone regions want to get independence, and so they have a lot of people have been killed, many people have been displaced, many people are in need of humanitarian aid. There's other crises more linked to like the surroundings of Cameroon, Boko Haram on the border with Nigeria. There's the Central African Republic on the east side of Cameroon, where there's a lot of refugees coming. So that you have a lot of refugees, but especially internally displaced people from the English-speaking areas. But there's also a lot of Anglophone people who have come before or during who are not IDPs, internally displaced people. So there's what I wrote here, it's almost 100,000 refugees and IDPs and asylum seekers. There's many more Anglophone people than that. Good. So it is a city of migrants in the sense of internal migrants. So half of the population is not originally from Douala, and there's a lot of tenants as well. So in 2014, which is already 10 years ago, 60% was renting. And so that probably has gone up if you look at the trends that have been there before. What I then did myself is a single case study. So I'm looking at the Anglophone tenants in Douala. I did semi-structured interviews with those tenants, focusing on their housing pathways and their current housing situation. I did 24 interviews, mostly Cameroonian. There was one Nigerian, but she was born in Cameroon. Mostly average or a median age, so was quite a wide range of ages. And so I did follow-up interviews with the people a year later as well. With almost everyone, I couldn't reach everyone. And I also did a little bit of triangulation, getting a bit of extra information from brokers, the two landladies, and some technicians that gave me additional perspectives. And then because I was living there, I also could exchange a lot with other people, getting different ideas. Good, we're finally getting to the first part of the findings of what then drives moving decisions of Anglophone migrants. the first, this part, I'm using a framework that is focused on migration in general. So what I did is I based my research on this framework, but then I looked at, does this framework then work in the context of residential mobility? Because migration tends to be out of cities, and this, my research then also includes the intra-urban, so within city mobility that people have, right? Or that people do. And so what this analysis, or what this framework looks at, is that there are certain drivers at the macro level, so more at the societal level. There are certain factors that might be working, like helping or blocking people to move, and then there are certain ones that are at the micro level, individual or household characteristics that influence the decision for people to migrate. And so that decision does not necessarily need to be that they move, but it could also be a decision to stay. So we also are looking at why are people staying. So I will go through the different levels, the different components. Or from the macro level perspective, you can see that Douala as a very attractive hub or economic hub, it does lead to a lot of people moving to Douala to find jobs, but because they find a lot of stiff competition there, they might also decide to leave again because they in the end, their conditions are quite unstable. So when you look at their perceived stability of the of their financial situation, you see that quite a lot are indicating that their situation is not very stable. You also have the translocal practices, so that's more the social and cultural component of it. So traditionally, this area, so Douala, Douala, Yaoundé, and the Anglophone areas have traditionally been very much interlinked. There was always a lot of movement, people going back in the weekend, working in Douala or in Yaoundé during the weekend and going back. So you can see that there's a lot of this translocal households, so people who have part of their family in the city and who have another part of their family in the Anglophone regions. And so this strong attachment to the paternal village remains. Even for those people who have never lived in the Anglophone regions, still this is a very African, if I can say, thing to kind of like have this attachment to the paternal village. And so lots of people will be thinking to go back at some point in their life. And if they can afford, they will be investing in that area, maybe even before investing in their life in Douala. So here, for example, this is Blessing. These are anonymized names, so like different pseudonyms, not the actual names. But so she has been living in Douala since she was born, but she identifies as Anglophone, so her parents are Anglophone. And so she actually, together with her husband, first built a house in her husband's village, and only then started investing in buying. So now they were saving for buying land in Douala, and they were going to construct in Douala. So you can see that this attachment remains strong even if they haven't lived there. Let me see what this is. The Anglophone, yes, the Anglophone crisis. So obviously the political component, so this Anglophone crisis has really led to a lot of people moving, either directly because they were displaced or because they couldn't find any opportunities anymore. So it's a main reason for coming to Douala for many, but also a reason not to go back. Yeah? So people either are waiting or they are deciding not to go back anymore because they're worried about their safety. And especially where they have, where their assets have been destroyed, they might also feel like this is estrangement. They have been away for so long, everyone else has moved out, so what is there to go back to? And so you also see those kinds of feelings where people are like, I would love to go back to Kumba, or to like this town in Anglophone South, but it really isn't the way it was anymore. And so people then will decide to settle in Douala rather than going back in the end. At the same time, there are a lot of safety concerns at the local level. So there's a lot of evictions, a lot of demolitions that are happening. A report from 2022 reported almost 250,000 people affected by that. And so also in my 24 small sample, there were 5 people who had been a victim of that, whose house was demolished or who were evicted from their house, like here the example from Loom. So they tried to organize at the neighborhood level to avoid the eviction, but then one morning they came with policemen and the caterpillar, and then people were informed that it was going to be demolished, but they weren't expecting that it would actually happen, because this often happens, right? People know that they're not legally, but then they're hoping that they can stay. Often it takes forever. They can still stay, but at some point they will just come one morning and demolish everything. So you can see that it affects people a lot as well. So she then decided to move back to the Anglophone areas, but then it turned out that the Anglophone crisis began, and so that's why she came back to Douala. There's a lot of land scams, so in that sense, people who want to invest, and so rather than renting, becoming homeowners, might be deterred because there is a high risk that when you buy land, it's not, or it might be sold to someone else. So this is the experience here from Mbua. Oh, sorry, here. So Mbua, he bought a plot, and then he because he is aware of that situation, he went there. So that's what he's saying. I always was there every week to verify. But then one day he came there and he only met a house. That's how he said it. So the person who sold the plot also sold it to someone else, and then that person was quicker in gathering all the money for putting some bricks there. So then he was left with nothing. He tried to get his money back, but so far he hasn't managed to do that. And so also you see that people decide to move because of like the urban safety. So there's like a lot of crime, and so certain areas are worse than others, and so people move within the city to find other better living conditions. Language, so now we are at the meso level. So what is helping or what is blocking people to move? And one thing that we were looking at is that people might choose a specific place to live in the city because of the language that is being spoken in that area. So you see there is a certain amount of residential sorting. There are certain areas where there is a lot of Anglophone people living together. And so also that attracts then even more Anglophone people because it helps for them in the language. Even though a lot of people will be bilingual, it still helps people, or they feel more at home in being around people who speak the same language. There also was, so one of the things that we were trying to find out was, is it a bad thing if you are a migrant, and especially if you don't speak the language? But so apparently the opposite was true. So actually, Anglophone tenants have kind of a reputation that they work hard and they always pay in time, and so they are honest, and so actually that turned out to be a positive thing for people. So they were actually well received and was seemingly easier to find or to get access to housing because of that positive stereotype. So that was something that was a bit surprising for me. Here, yes. So the trans-local networks really help. So people already, before coming to the city, they usually have certain family members already living somewhere. So for example, their father or their aunt or their cousins, friends, mother. So sometimes it really is a very weak link to that person, but so very often people will first stay in the city free of charge at that family or at this relations person's place, often for a year or more. So actually almost half of the people stayed free of charge, and of those, almost everyone stayed for 1 year at that person's place. Usually they will either help out or they will help in the costs, but they don't have to pay rent themselves. And so then the idea also is then to give forward, so when they then establish themselves, they will often host people themselves who are then the newcomers at that point. So you can see that experience here of Juliet. So she is currently living with her husband, with her 4 children, but then she's also taking care of 3 family children. Because of the Anglophone crisis is really targeting attacks on schools. So for a lot of children, they're being sent to Douala to go to school. Otherwise, they can't go to school. And so the parents are still in Anglophone areas, but the children then come to live with the family members. And so then you see that this is, in a way, quite a financial burden and also leads to overcrowding. So there were some complaints about that. Mobility, the telecommunication kind of really helps. So you can see that this creates the opportunities and it gives the information for people to move to Douala, but also because then that can be anywhere, it might also help people to move away, even further away. You see a lot of people are dreaming to move to Europe or to other countries. And so it might help people to come to Douala, but it might also help people to continue or to in the step migration later on. At the micro level then, so now we're talking about the individual or the household level, you can see that a lot of women would join their partner. It was never the man who joined the woman, so you still have that quite strongly in the Cameroonian context. And then if there would be a breakup, then either they would move within the town or they would move back to their parental village. There were quite a lot of distress moves, so people who had health problems, they couldn't afford anymore, just the financial instability, the landlord who would die, and so they couldn't stay in their housing anymore. They would have a conflict with neighbors, so that this would be like at the individual level or at the household level, people who would then have to move quite suddenly often. On the other hand, some people would like to move, but they didn't feel that they could afford to, so they felt a bit stuck. So that's the quote here from Alfred, I think. He says, "What keeps me in Douala is the money. If not, he would like to go back to Bamenda, to the Anglophone area." These were like more the immediate causes, but you also see that there is like a relationship with the perhaps more deeper causes. So people's place attachment. So how much do they feel at home in Douala, but also what are their moving aspirations? And so you see that influences how much they invest in having a nice place in Douala. And the more they feel at home, the more they might be inclined to stay, or the more they want to move, the more they are trying to get out as well. So you see that even some people who have been there for a long time, they still don't feel at home. And some people who then had their house evicted, they also don't feel at home anymore. So he used to feel at home, but now he isn't feeling at home anymore. And so he was actually thinking of moving out of Cameroon altogether. So it links actually the past moving behavior to future moving aspirations. Good. So that was the first part. Altogether, so when looking at that framework that we adopted from Black, we could see that there, at the macro level, it works out quite well for the context that we used it for, but these factors relating to safety and security, like the evictions, like the demolitions, like the land scams, they were not very much present, so that was something that we proposed to add. At the meso level, it's more the language, ethnicity, and then at the micro level, it's to have events. I think I've talked about all of that, so I'm going to go through that very quickly. I don't know how long I have already talked.
No, 30 minutes.
30 minutes, okay. So this part is shorter because it's much work in progress, so I'll present this. So this is then the part of how do Anglophone migrants get access to the rental housing in Douala, and is that rental housing adjusted for mobile populations? So this is very much work in progress. What I will do is just explain a little bit the framework itself. So this is based on a framework on land transactions that we were using in Kampala, or in this research that I talked about in the very beginning. And maybe you have ideas of like a better framework that might be more appropriate because it was more focused on land, and already now trying to do the analysis, I'm starting to see maybe it's not the best. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you. But so how we had I put it together there, and how I have now adjusted it is that to say the process in itself is not a one-off or a thing that happens just like that, right? It's a whole process, it takes time. And so you need first to find someone that you can rent from, or you, as a landlord, you need to find a tenant, right? So who is involved in that? How do people find each other? And how do people access information to find each other? So that's the first part. Then valuing, so what kind of people are they looking for? Is there a certain selection that they make? How do they recognize that that person is legitimate, that they don't have bad intentions, that they're not trying to scam them? How are they setting the prices? How are they, what are the different conditions of the payments? And then how do they contract what kind of agreement do they make? What kind of, how is that agreement validated? And lastly, when they are then renting, how do they avoid being evicted, or how do they make sure that they can stay there, right? So that's kind of like the whole process that is there. What I will do is, rather than giving you a whole explanation of how it works in the context and then thinking about is it now adjusted, I've kind of like compressed all of that in one. And so what you can see is my thinking, my current thinking, and this is really also where I would very much invite you to think along, where I think that in blue, I think where it might help the mobile population, and in red, where I think it might be more of a barrier for mobile populations, right? So overall, people actually said it's quite easy. A lot of people were saying it's easy to find housing in Douala. It's not very difficult. But when you see that a lot of them stay for 1 year before they actually move to their own place, it doesn't seem to be that easy to find housing. But okay, I think the fact that that they find it easy seemingly is a positive thing. Having the information is very dispersed, so there isn't any platform where you can find it, so it's not publicly available. So I think especially if you're new in the city, it might be much more difficult because you don't have those networks yet, right? Most people then would find their housing through the network, so if you have those networks, that's a positive thing. If you don't have it, it's a negative thing. Or they would walk around and just ask around, like, okay, is this place available? Is this place available? Do you know of any place available? So that's a very usual way. There were, out of the 24, there were 5 who used real estate agents. Some of them are like really formal ones. Others are more like what they call des marcheurs. So these are just people who are in the neighborhood and they're observing and they kind of have that information, but they're not officially real estate agents. These tend to be more expensive, so that's then a negative thing. But so if you then don't have the networks, then that would be your what you have to resort to. If you want to visit houses, it would be €5,000 per visit, which when you look at 5,000 francs, sorry, €7.5, sorry. No, so, but if you see that most people would rent their house for less than 40,000, which is €60 per month, this is actually quite expensive to visit. Now, this I only learned from people who used real estate agents, so I think perhaps the people walking around, they might have not have to pay, and also people said this is negotiable. So. Lots of things are negotiable, so this might just be the standard price, and then from there it can be negotiated. There is a lot of positive stereotyping, that's what we talked about before. There is also negative ones for other tribes. So the Bamoun tribe, they seemingly have certain religious, spiritual kind of traditions that are not appreciated, and so people don't like to have them. There are certain professions, so policemen, lawyers, they don't want to have them because they might create problems, Muslims, large families, etc. So there are certain groups that might have more difficulties in finding access to rental markets. In recognizing, so how to then know that the other person is a good person to rent from or to rent to. So the landlords almost always need proof of income so that you have some kind of work and that you can pay, right? That's what they are interested in. This obviously, if you have just come to the city, this might be very problematic. This might not be possible. There are differences between the types of landlords. I'm not going to go into detail about this, but there are the bigger landlords that are not in Cameroon who might be less flexible. The local small ones who are in bad areas of Cameroon, of Douala, where it's flooding a lot, they might be happy to get someone and just ask for a recommendation, but even that might be difficult to get, right? Calculating, so how to know the price, I think one very big thing that came out for many people, especially the migrants, is that there's a large advance rent that is being requested. So when you start renting, you need to pay at least almost always 8 to 10 months in advance, but some people would negotiate only up to 8 months, and plus security deposit, right? And so then during those first 8 months, or if you have negotiated 8 months, you then don't pay rent, so you're kind of using that, but you still need to make sure that you have that money, and so a lot of people would struggle, and especially if you then move a lot, you would then always need to make sure that you have that amount of money for paying them. And if you don't want to pay for so many months, then the price would go up. You would have to pay more per month. There is this story where informal agents who would organize the housing for you would get a continuous commission, so you would always pay through them, and so they would always keep 5,000 per month for it with them. And there's the shared utilities, which is usually not negotiable, that might also add on to the price. For contract and holding, so rental contracts were not very common, so that's a very weak position, but that's not specifically something that affects the mobile populations only. There is a certain leniency before people are evicted. So actually quite a few tenants admitted that they had rent arrears. So they had already spent all of their 8 months that they had paid in advance, and then they didn't have money, and so they kind of stayed. So there seems to be some leniency before being evicted, but so then there is also this example of Eta whose landlord took the door out so that because he didn't pay the rent. So there are certain, you can see where not having a contract leads to certain conditions that are not ideal, let's say it like that. The rents didn't go up a lot when people are renting, but you see that they have been steadily rising in town, like the average price of the rent has been rising, and so every time you move, then actually you end up finding, or your price would go up. So the more you move, the more mobile you are, the higher you would end up paying because of rents continuously going up. And then the positive thing that I found is that actually a lot of people would not ask for their security deposit back, but just use it by living there another 2 months that they had paid the deposit. So there is certain flexibility there. In conclusion, so you see that there is also here that the translocal networks are very important for finding and recognizing, and that there is like this intersectionality. So the migrants are not only because they're migrants, but often because they are living in more poorer conditions, because of the difference in language, of ethnicity, because of their lower unstable income, that they have more disadvantages. So not just because they come from somewhere else. And then I think one of the big things that came out is this advance rent payment that can reduce residential mobility. And it can also lead to financial losses. So when people are then evicted, they might not get their advance payment back. Good. Just going back to what I would like to learn from you, just putting it there again before saying thank you very much, and looking forward to discuss together.
Okay, thanks, Els. Excellent. Just was thinking that many of those things seems quite like a very next future for Portugal, if not for Europe. I mean, we are definitely moving toward that direction of hyper flexi. Especially, I was thinking, now if you move, the rent is higher, and you're pushed to move, and the rent gets higher. So when we think about learning from the south, it's much more concrete than we may often think, and maybe we Europeans should definitely be a bit more humble in our thinking as Europeans. But no further ado, and Joanna, please, the floor is yours.
Well, first, thank you for the invitation to take some time to read your work and now to see it presented. So to make this connection between the person, the writer, the researcher, the visuals, and I invite you. I think the first thing is I invite you all to read the 4 papers I read of Els, which explain in a very detailed and a very interesting way, because they use both qualitative research and quantitative research on this broader question of residential mobility. But I think that the question of residential mobility, which we also find it, everywhere, because people move everywhere. It's very interesting when we see it from the context of from the African context, specifically from the how do you say it, Sub-Saharan Africa. Mainly because, and last year we had the Biennale, the Architectural Biennale at Venice, and Leslie Loco named that she was the curator for the exhibition, and it was called Future Lab, all based in the idea that Africa would be the place where we should put our reflection on the way is paving the way from these new ideas of urbanization, but also on a type of, I would say, ancestral crib of humanity. So in a sense, I think that it is a very rich context. Simone had already said one of my first impressions, because that's and maybe I should say just one sentence or two about myself. I'm an architect, and I work in the context of housing precarity, and now I'm working on a project called Care for Housing, and we do work with mainly Africans or African descendants, and the majority are from Cape Verde, which is an archipelago, so it's slightly different, but also from São Tomé, which is Sub-Saharan Africa, and a lot of people either migrate to Portugal from there or to Cameroon or nearby, because it's in that Gulf. So a lot of this circular migration, which we find here, and we work with a circular migration that it's transnational, but it really relies on the same type of, for instance, place attachment and mobility choices, and even in the same micro, meso, and micro levels that you mentioned, although language here is slightly taken for granted, because they, as formerly colonized countries, they also speak Portuguese, so there is this common ground on the, language is also an issue. So I would say that we could use the exactly same framework to understand this. And for instance, it's very nice when we can start to weave all these ideas of why do people live for 1 year at relatives or friends or using their networks. Maybe it's because they have to earn some money to pay that 6 months of friends. So in one way, when you go to that micro level, you can weave and inform the macro level because you have that need to proof of income, an initial advance of rent, and obviously you can't, unless you have a stable and a secure job and very kind of connections, you cannot arrive to a place and make it immediately. And what I found interesting to think, and maybe that could be because this is what we have been seeing in our project, is that when people arrive, they rely on this type of networks on the basis of retribution. So in a sense, sometimes they don't pay rent. So it's a contribution because I moved here, but a couple of years ago, your sister-in-law was in my house back then. So there is this type of economical way of providing housing for this initial phase until you go to the market and you find a place. So it somehow resonated with the way we see migration, and especially this transnational migration works around here with us and within our context of and that it is more related with something that I don't know if you are going to work, but kind of an anthropological, a more anthropological view on this idea of place attachment. I don't know if we need to reframe what is place attachment, because this idea of this is not my home is the place where I was born, and but I'm living here for 20 years. And we see very kind of, people are not lying, but it's much more complex than that. So I think that working with this idea of place attachment, it would be interesting to kind of detail it, probably in a more kind of anthropological way, because what we see from our experience, and it really connects with your interviews and especially with your other 2 papers I've read, it's this idea of people that are living, for instance, in Portugal, but at the same time they, for instance, they don't move back totally, but once they have the chance, they go there, stay a few months, and then they return, then they say, and all this continuum, and probably then they themselves become landlords, because if you go for a bigger period. So I think there is a lot of this kind of in-between, kind of liminal situations that sometimes with surveys and questionnaires and even interviews, but it's difficult to grasp. So for me that was very interesting, because it's really kind of connects with and just to give a kind of a short example, we are following some families from the following some families through the houses, so to see what type of houses they built. They are self-built houses in a neighborhood bordering Lisbon, and then we went to see the houses that they built in their place of origin, and one Cape Verdean man is an old man now, and because it's getting cold, so he goes to Cape Verde, and in Cape Verde he stays in his place that he built a house for himself, but he's being cared by because he's kind of an old person. He's being cared by a lady with whom and she was there. She's here. Sorry, I'm losing my English. She's here kind of at least once a year, and she stays in his house. So all these kind of networks that go beyond the market, and I think it would be interesting because they represent kind of economic value. They represent a way of sheltering people, and they are based on this idea of solidarity that it's on the other hand of these violent processes and land scams that you presented that are, you know, with very kind of impressive numbers. So yeah, I think this idea of the place land, I'm just seeing all my small small notes. So the safety and security, and how can you cope that in the the macro level, and related that and be informed also by the micro level. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we should open to the audience or to react. Yes.
So, well, thank you very much for your comments. This work. I think it's very interesting, and I think we really need to talk a bit more later also on what you are doing and how these things can connect. One thing I wanted to react on is that indeed actually the first paper I had set up, or the first findings I had actually linked it with place attachment, but then the idea, like it didn't come out strong enough, so that we kind of took it out, but I agree it's something very important to look into. And one of the things that we very strongly said, and that also came out of the interviews, is that people indeed, they feel at home in more than one place, right? And so it's not necessarily that if they have that strong connection to their paternal village, that they don't feel at home in the city. Yeah. Thank you.
I have a short question. The majority of people you interviewed, they were building in the village, or?
I think there were, out of the 20, I don't have the exact numbers, I think there were about 6 or 7 that had property in their village. Either they had already built or they had bought land. Some of them had stopped building because of the Anglophone crisis, and then there were quite a few who have family land, is what they refer it to, right? So it's land that is shared by different family members, like the parents have died, but then the children kind of like own the land and are not, so they can't have an individual claim, but they have a common claim to that land.
Okay, we can take some questions. We have a couple here. If someone online wants to raise hands or write down, please do.
Yeah, thanks, Els. Yeah, I think you showed quite well, and I think the wording you used is like a violent situation, how many of these choices aren't actually free choices, like, you know, oh, I'd like to go to a nicer place, or oh, I'd like to move here or there, but there is, of course, like both in the move, like from the rural place to the urban place, there is a kind of violent displacement, maybe because of war, but also because of the destruction of sort of rural lifestyles, which has been happening, I guess, all over Africa for many reasons. But also, once people arrive, they're in a very unstable situation. They have no tenancy security, you know, like so all these reasons. Even though, like, they will find some security through familial networks or sort of networks that they have like from before. I think you showed quite well how people are coping with that violent situation they're in. So the only question I have is that the framework you use, like in the beginning you introduced this as planning for a mobile population, and also the framework you used in this, like how to find, it seemed more like frameworks which are more, or come from a background of an assumption of like equal negotiating power, you know, like you're a tenant and you negotiate with the landlord and you have the right. And actually this is not, it doesn't seem to be the case at all, like really at all. So I think it's super interesting that you showed, okay, there are different ways that people try to find security through their family networks, so like, you know, how they're trying to do that, but actually it's not the case. So I'm not sure, like, if you think about where you want to go with this in the sense of planning for mobile populations, maybe most of these people would not say to you, my personal choice is being mobile, you know, like populations are being mobile, so should we plan for them being mobile, or should we plan for them having tenancy security and having safe housing and secure housing? So I think you need to be a bit like, you know, like where do you start and where do you want to end up? So I think these are sort of more methodological questions. I think what you found out is super interesting and can be used to make very strong cases for certain planning goals, you know. But it's, yeah, I guess it's just the question of how you frame it and what framework you use to analyze your findings.
Yeah, thank you for the very interesting presentation. I just have a small question, as I don't know, as you mentioned that you also, that some of the people were planning to emigrate from Cameroon, so, and as I don't know your work more widely, so I was wondering, have you had a chance to then also follow up some of these people who might have emigrated, and where do they go to? Thank you.
I think you can take this one and then another one.
Good, thank you very much. To say the choice to be mobile or not, I think indeed it is important. I think at the same time there is the reality, so then like do we need, as planners, how can we care for that? In a way it is only like more like the broader interest why I am interested in understanding this better, but then it is definitely something to think about as well. Is that really what we want to plan for, or do we want to then help for them to be less mobile in case they would prefer that, right? Very much appreciated that comment. The migration aspirations. So I did do a follow-up interview a year later. I managed to reach almost all of them. I think for a lot of them, it is more of a distant dream than actual possibility. But there are definitely, so one actually is, one I know she is now studying in Rwanda. So there's one who I know that because I have been following up with her a bit longer as well. But then for others, so you do often hear that people already have networks abroad, especially the US, but also in the UK, because of the Anglophone connections, I think. But then, yeah, Nigeria, of course, as well. But then the ones that I couldn't reach, then maybe it is because they migrated, perhaps also it's because they were not reachable. So I don't know. All the others were still there. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Els. I think maybe it relates a bit to what Julia was saying as well. I think there might also be some interesting things you could draw from looking into the literature on housing choices, the housing choice set, the idea that you have everyone has opportunities and possibilities, but also restraints, and that kind of comes together to create some sort of choice set. And within that you can choose. So for some, obviously the choice set is much larger than for others, but most people have some sort of agency even if it's small. And it's sometimes interesting to look into that particular agency. So even if your choices are very small, you do make choices, as we see here. Even to live for a year amongst with family is a choice. Why do you do that, as opposed to maybe more quickly finding something else? So I think there might be some references there that you could go into. It's maybe not so much a planning literature, but it might help you understand some of the choices being made. And I think you could also potentially add something to that literature, also the literature on housing careers and housing pathways, because in general there is this, when we talk about housing careers and housing pathways, there's this idea that we're always aiming to go higher somehow, that we're trying to improve on housing, moving up the housing ladder, notions like that. And I think what you can show quite convincingly, I would guess, and would add to the literature more generally, would be something on how closely linked this housing choice is to so many other choices, so that you can't understand a housing career without understanding the other things going on in your life, and that if you're localized within one community, then maybe you're tending towards moving up the housing ladder. But when you're moving between places, then you might have to move down the housing ladder, so to speak, in order to move up on other ladders, or move ahead in other pathways, and in this case you also talk about having ideas to eventually move to the city where your husband is from, or the village where your husband is from, which again implies something that rather than having this pathway where you choose the next step, then you're like choosing some steps, you know where you want to end up. So it's not like I choose the next step, you're choosing a next step while knowing that you want to end up eventually at this step, whatever it is. So I think you could engage with that discussion, and I think you could add to it as well. So that would, it wasn't a question, it was more of a suggestion on where to go, and I'll be happy to provide you with some references. I did a lot of that on myself, so I think you can go into that and do something there.
Oh, yeah.
Impressive, Els and Joanna. Impressive that you really have learned so much about that population, their struggles, and the way they try to get housing and all of that. So probably you know much more than we know about our tenants here, because we really have to know much more about the private rental sector, so per se, the strategies of tenants, also the situation. We don't have inquiries and surveys in Portugal, like for example you see in England, for example, and landlords. Okay, it's just that one. I'm sorry, I was not aware of that. You have to. Yes. Some people are doing work, and good work, with trying to understand. But in fact, that was not what I wanted to say. I just wanted I wanted to follow from what Riga said, because I think it was really a good suggestion, and also what Julia said, because I think they are connected. I remember when I visit Denmark, and once we were in Finland in some conference, and they developed a project also about how the immigrants were moving around in intersectors, for example, in the housing options. And I remember a specific one paper from Hans Gifter Andersen, if I'm not wrong with others, that says the importance of the public sector for the immigrants. That, I think it connects very well. Because once you get all the information about these people that are so mobile, you have to think which tenor answers, and what should be talking about policy goals, as Julie said, and now the planning, knowing that information is what should we provide. So I think things are going well. Thanks.
The comments are very well taken. Thank you so much. No, and I think indeed, so for me, one of the interests was indeed to look at like how is it from the tenant's perspective, right? And so what are their restraints, but then also what are their choices that they have. And I do hope in that third findings paper to then go also a little bit more on like what is it that that people are looking for, what is important for them when they are looking for housing, and so what are the different options that they have, and are those options then suited to their preferences. One example is one of the people who is actually currently living in Douala. He is from the Anglophone areas, but then his family is living in the north, and so he is kind of like sending a lot of money back to his Anglophone area, but he's also then sustaining his family in the north, and so for him what is important is to save as much money as possible. So he really chose to just rent a very small room, but then there needs to be some conditions when his family is coming over that they can still stay at this place. So you can see the kind of like the trade-offs that people are making when they are looking for their places. So that is something that I hope to look into a little bit more still. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. And thank you also for the presentation and for some moments that although I haven't been, that I didn't have a phone, I haven't been in that part of Africa or Cameroon, but in some moments I really felt that I am at home, because working with Roma population in formal settlements, there are in Serbia some patterns, some about how to find an apartment in a new city, how they are moving, how they are cooperating between themselves, how the family is organized, how they are staying with relatives, what challenges they are facing to approach the rental sector are quite familiar. So as Simon mentioned at the very beginning, that Europe is becoming close. So in some, so, and also you John, as you said, that there are a lot of similarities here in Lisbon. So maybe in your, if you are broadening some bit of comparison in your research, maybe you can also look in this part of Europe also, so that not just in Serbia, but also in whole region there are some researches about that, about how Roma community and other communities are facing this situation. Also at the macro level, all these levels, as 3 levels as you mentioned, also even with the language, also we are referring as a Roma population, there are speaks different languages, some of them, you know, it's quite, as I said, quite similar. And also it is, when we are looking at the other side, it is not just about what they, of course, it is very important what they can afford, what they want, what are their preferences, but also when we are speaking about the planning side, it is what options are offered to them and how actually we can work on that to improve options that are according to their needs. So it is the really place for and the room for participation and inclusion of those population. And when we are thinking about the options, about planning for mobile population, so it is what actually are their needs and preferences, and to really include them in all those plans. So that's.
No, I just wanted to add 2 things. First of all, my PhD was part of the project you're talking about, so it's linked in that sense. No, I thought in the example you were giving about this man sending things home, I think there is also something you could look for in the concept of reciprocity. And looking into that also, we have, I mean, in the Nordic countries, in Denmark, we've seen also with a lot of Turks and Somalis moving to Denmark, it has been quite a substantial part of their housing choice that they had to consider what they wanted to do in their homeland. So even if they moved to Denmark and they were planning to stay there for a while, they felt like they had obligations at home because their their families were struggling. In some cases, you would also see that you had pooled money in order to allow someone from the village to move away. But that meant that you were the only one who had kind of gotten out, and therefore you had to now make a good life for yourself to make it worth it. But you also then had to send some of that money back, investing it back in where you came from to allow either others to come as well, or to give them a better life at home. So I think going back to some of the literature on migration and how what choices you make in the relation between being a migrant and housing could be relevant here as well.
This is quite intimidating. I'm still thinking on Paula's first comment, because as you, Paula, right? I got
Julia.
Julia, sorry. Because I think your first question was what to plan for, and I think your comment was really kind of the nailing point of if are we planning for this mobility, aren't we reinforcing it? So I think that my question back to you was that, I don't know if you could explain us a little bit more in the context of planning now, not like choices or kind of research paths, but in the terms of planning, if there is any connection with planning for this in the expansion of the city or in the context of the city, because from our experience, planning is tricky, because in some ways is kind of not very transparent, as you mentioned in your not transparent in a way that you don't know, it's not very well defined, and in some the other side of that is that sometimes it's copied, especially we have that it's not an impression, it's really a fact, from Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, São Tomé. Sometimes it's just a copy of the planning instruments that we have in Portugal, like so badly adapted, especially what I know, Angola and Cape Verde. So they use more or less the same kind of tools for a context that it's very different in the type of urbanization, etc. So if you could elucidate us a little bit more about the planning process and how to plan for this, even though we know, as Julia said, that we don't want to reinforce that people need to be mobile, but how can we, and I was just remembering the work of Nelson Mota. He's in Delft, and he looked somehow at the planning instruments and the colonial inheritance of places, and now what to do with that, and how can we make better planning for a place with all this kind of history.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think in South Africa, Sub-Saharan African context, the gap between theory and practice is really very big. So if you look at the legislation that is there, it tends to be very much based or still from the colonial times. The practice is completely different in that there hardly is any planning that is being followed. So when you look at those flood areas, like almost or so much of the urban expansion is happening in areas that every year get flooded multiple times, right? So there is actually a lot of things that through planning you could, or through better planning you could help to reduce. At the same time, because there's so few resources, there is actually very little capacity. So you have very few human resources, but you also have hardly any financial resources. So it makes it really very difficult for municipalities to do anything at all. And so because they kind of are always running behind the situation, also like those numbers, right? If you see that every single day you should be building 65 housing units, it's also so impossible to even imagine in a context where you would have all the resources anyways, right? But so what you see is then there is a lot of reactive governance and it's very haphazard. So one example that happened quite recent, or like just before I left, was that there was a lot of rain, and so then because the soil becomes very unstable, there was one major building collapse. There were a few others, but so one where about 40 people died because the building collapsed. And so then people were crying out, like, look, why are we all building in these areas where we shouldn't be building? And so the municipality felt they had to react. So what they did was they said, okay, we will do research in what other buildings are structurally unstable. And so they identified 40 others. I would say quite randomly. There was one actually where it seemed like rather than an unstable building, it was more that there was some kind of conflict between the brothers and one had said that this is unstable. So there's like all kinds of local politics then also coming in. And so those buildings were going to be demolished. But so it's like, why those and not others? There must be like thousands probably that are in the same conditions, bad quality of construction in areas where they shouldn't have been built. But so then, already, so I can understand from the municipality's perspective how difficult the situation is, but then maybe there is a little bit more systematization that would be possible. But yeah, it's a very wicked problem in general. It's not easy to solve.
Can I say? Just to give you context on the Portuguese legislation, and also when in 1969 one building collapsed, like a 5-story building, something like that, in an area where a lot of other buildings, it's called Brandoa, a lot of other buildings were being built without any planning and in the outskirts of Lisbon, then they made legislation. So I think that just to give a context that even in Europe and just less 50-something years ago, it was the same case. So just to give it's not just in Africa.
Yanis.
Olá, boa tarde. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, great. It's just, maybe it's more a note or even a provocation. First of all, thanks a lot for the presentation and the interventions as well. So what for me was really interesting to see and to hear is like the linkage between family and the housing trajectories. And what was still in my head is like, as you told us that there was some person in your research that they preferred to construct or to build or to turn themselves into real house owners in their native village, not the urban area, right? That is full of risks and full of adherence, like to maintain and to create a shelter that is a home, and that is something that can last into future. And then we hear about, and we know from other contexts as well, that there's a lot of this importance of the network, either between rural and urban areas, either between nations, either between continents. So the provocation maybe is a bit here that, in these cases, or maybe since ever, the provision of housing in a lot of contexts is done by these networks, and family is a big part of it. And just because there is still this idea that the individual can reach anywhere. Either you work hard and either you make a big effort to reach somewhere and to get a house for your own. So these like fairy tale, we can really like destroy with what you proposed here today. I think it's really obvious that this fairy tale is not working and has never really worked for the masses. And so it's just another contribution to say, here family or the network is really filling the void of provision, right? Like, and we all know these stories. I mean, people that are researching housing in Portugal or in other African countries, there's always this migration somewhere, right? When can I go? When should I go? Where? And all these trade-offs that you mentioned, some of them as well, like how who are those families and those people that are able to move from the rural areas to the urban areas, and then even maybe do a further step and move to another country in Africa, or even immigrate to Europe. So there's a lot of embeddedness in these networks, right? And then there is this kind of duty as well, that you contribute back if you reach some certain higher step on those various ladders. So I don't really know if it's a note, it's a provocation. Thank you very much, and keep on the work. Thank you.
As I said, we don't have other questions. I will add maybe the last. And it's in fact three things. First is, it's a pity you abandoned those vignettes of personal trajectories. I don't think you need to have quantity to make that relevant. I'm thinking about a paper by Emiliano Esposito on squatting in public housing in Naples. And well, he with Francesco Chiodelli, his co-author, they write his article based on four trajectories for families, which exemplify a number of dimensions. And so to publish it, you don't need to demonstrate those is 20%, 30% of the weight, but that you can tell a story about how these trajectories work. And that would be very interesting, I think. Second, linking to Julia's earliest points. Yeah, I mean, I'm somehow a planner who's recuperating for having been a planner, and so definitely that's how planners tend to go to the field and say, okay, now we have to plan, and the suggestion to look also at other literatures is probably adequate, especially in the sense that how the mindset, imaginary of planning is so European that however you want to pause or decolonize it, you're still thinking through very specific lens. Even in our conversations here, very many things. Oh, the family is covering up for the failure of the state. But that idea that the state should be the deliverer of universal welfare is extremely European. Are you respondent truly expecting the state to provide for that, or are there different arrangements, different assemblage of expectations, of imaginaries, and then the space for planning, the potential space for planning there? And so in this sense, whatever trajectory you follow, I think it will be important to read about the African cities from perspectives like Abdul Malik Simon. You know, this idea of the surrounds, of how the informality is not informality, it's how things work in certain contexts, and it's not about being better or worse, it's about understanding how the various actors play in different contexts. And the third thing, but this is like just, since he used the term of mobility, it opens to a broader field, which is not just migration. And I was just thinking how maybe what's going on lately is that this increase of mobility is happening at the extremes of the spectrum. You have, these people who are mobile because of the violence of urbanization, and other people who are extremely mobile because, digital nomads, etc. So I'm not saying you should embed those. But that made me think about this mobility. Even in African cities, it's where the expats have always been, this very mobile, wealthy world who lived very specific areas. But coming back to Europe, we are seeing this increased mobility on both sides of the spectrum in a city like Lisbon. So that was just a reflection on how this acceleration of mobility happens all around the world. But of course, the previous point needs to have more, not even local, more context-driven epistemologies, probably for us to really understand what's going on.
I think so. For me, indeed, I would really like to have more local perspective. At the same time, you do see that a lot of the thinking, even in Africa, there's been perhaps some brainwashing of the European context, and so there is a lot of expectations that the state should provide. And so even like my work that I did in Cameroon on trying to engage the population in participating in the local budgeting, so you feel that there's a lot of expectations of what is now the responsibility of the state and what is the responsibility of citizens. And even where traditionally it would have been the people themselves who had provided, they are now expecting that it is the state. So there is certain expectations that perhaps through this colonial influence have pervaded and are now there. And do we then want to revert it? How do we want to how do they want to plan around that? Right, so I think it's very interesting to think around that. And so you see, especially housing provision, there is no housing provision by the state. It doesn't exist, right? So it is all private, but so then how can the state still somehow intervene in making sure that there are basic conditions, or that there are that people are living in decent conditions, and even that at the moment is very difficult to secure. Let me see what we were talking about before. Yeah, the different
Yanis on families.
Yeah, and the giving back. So I think the idea of who. So I think this mutual support, right? And so if you are the one who is being sent, so this translocal household, even the very definition of what is a household in Africa is very fluid, right? So who is my brother? Who is my cousin? So people just refer to, this is my mother, and then, okay, actually it is the aunt of my second father, or whatever. So these things are, people just say brother and mother and father, and it's very easy. It's much more loose in who is then how related to whom, and much less strict than what we have here. And so you have then a certain ease in living together because you all consider each other as relatives, but at the same time, people also do want their own privacy. So you do see that people moving out after this extended stay with their relatives, there is this idea I wanted to be independent because I want a place for myself, and so you do see that there is this it's a difficult balance between how much do they invest in their own well-being and having their own place for themselves because they are craving that, but then also how much do they then still have for sending back and for kind of this mutual helping each other. Quite some people who then arrived and did find their own accommodation but are not financially very stable yet, they do still receive help from the village, so it's not only that they're sending back, so you really see that the remittances are going both ways, not necessarily in terms of money, but also in food, people sending different goods to each other, and so there is really an exchange that is, it's very fluid. It also goes with the idea of the family being much more of a fluid concept, not just the nuclear family.
Just because this is, we have a saying in Portugal that says that conversations are like cherries. I don't know if could be another level of analysis and if it's doable, but what are the expectations of the families? because I think it could be interesting because we have our own expectations of families related in providing accommodation, providing. So what is expected as you, as someone who is from the west part of the country and moves to a kind of a more, so expectations of what you are expected to provide to your extended family, because that could limitate choice, as you were saying, you know, mapping all the criteria and something, I don't know, I was thinking, and probably that wouldn't be a criteria for me, because, I don't know, maybe the expectations of my extended family towards me are low in terms of, you know, sending goods or, so it's really different model of family and the expectations of what you are, so maybe that it's an influence also on choice, because you need to make that, so maybe a nice criteria, which is, I don't think it's very studied, at least.
On that, I think we can call this a day. It was a great discussion, thanks to your stimulus. So thanks, Els. Thanks, everyone else. Thanks online, just Yanis now. And, well, have a nice weekend.